Binge. And we're on episode 4, which is really ironic because we're just now getting to the main event. Issues 1 through 4 will be reviewed today. And we have a pretty crazy show, as always. The Infinite Crisis binge has been nothing but spectacular, at least in my opinion, to everybody. I love it. And I'm excited to get into like the beginnings of this really crazy story we're about to venture into. And Chris, the Reverend Clow, has a lot to talk about with this series. But before I get into all that, there's some introductions here. I'll be joined by the Knights of Knee here. Hello. How are we doing?
We're doing good.
Doing well.
Excellent. All right. Excellent. Sorry, my screen doesn't show me you guys are all here yet, but 1 second here. And yeah, what have you guys been up to? Anything interesting?
Living life, trying to stay alive. That's all.
That's it, man. Just living the dream.
Living that dream. Living that dream. Well, yeah, it's been crazy over here, and yeah, I'm really glad we're all getting started here. 1 second here, I'm making sure Chris, you added so many pictures, I can't even find what's going on here. There we go. There. See, I got all mixed up. See, that's what happens when you have too many pictures. You always forget where you're at. So anyway, thank you, Chris. So today we have issues 1 through 4. Chris, you wanted to read a little intro. So why don't you have at it, sir? I'll let you have the floor. What are you reading us today?
Yeah, so this is going to be a part of the introduction to the Absolute Edition of Infinite Crisis, and I really feel like it does a good job of kind of setting the tone. So I'm just going to jump into it.
Okay, let's do it.
Following Crisis on Infinite Earths, the new lean and streamlined DC universe was revitalized, energized, and renewed, as if with a 4-color blood transfusion from a youthful donor. But with the reduction it had done on parallel lives, duplicate worlds, and multiple realities, lost much of its raison d'etre. With the exception of 0 Hour Crisis in Time, an attempt to heal some plot wounds inflicted by Crisis's house-cleaning exercise, and Crisis Times 5, a 4-part story in which the Justice League and remaining JSA members join forces against a menace from the 5th dimension, the Crisis brand was quietly shelved for almost 20 years. Then in 2004, DC Comics published a very different, far more challenging Crisis in Identity Crisis by writer Brad Meltzer and artist Rags Morales. In the post-9/11 world, there came a dawning sense that American superheroes had become irrelevant. Grown to maturity from a cultural mulch of forward-looking positivity, they seemed completely out of step with the national and even global mood following the terrorist assault on the World Trade Center towers. The Boy Scout morals of the superheroes now seemed hopelessly idealistic, utterly naive, and even childish. Those elements of exuberant high fantasy and science fiction that had dominated the comics of the late 90s suddenly appeared frivolous and trivial in the face of world events. As the internet became ubiquitous, as it became harder and harder to ignore a massive tidal bore of information that strongly suggested the world wasn't actually the happy-clappy mono-capitalist theme park we'd been pretending to live in for so long, a period of ruthless self-interrogation was called for, with our cultural heroes, our archetypes, first on the firing line. To survive this scouring reappraisal of Western culture's vanities and assumptions, to honestly tackle the mood and the issues of a new century, our superheroes would be required to reinvent themselves. Identity Crisis turned the spotlight of cynicism and hurt on the superhero narrative with a brutal post-Watchmen take on the DC heroes. Framed as a murder mystery, Brad Meltzer used Identity Crisis to deconstruct the Justice League and the assumptions of the Silver Age that had given them life. A new narrative was emerging, a uniquely American critique of the country's own youthful cowboy rebel hero, the imperialist final frontiering pioneer, the 60s sci-fi superhero. The Silver Age science paragons of the Justice League had become a perfect metaphor for America's innocence and optimism, as its folly and humanity emerged in a flourish of anguished, sweating, sobbing glory. Meltzer and Morales' Justice League stood in for the USA of George Bush and the betrayal of the Kennedy Star Trek ethos. It was against this backdrop, 20 years after the release of Crisis, that Infinite Crisis was conceived and created, ostensibly a commemorative event designed as a direct sequel to the original Crisis. This story, in no small part due to the intelligence and commitment of its creators, snorted up to the starting line with a little more ambition. Enter Jeff Johns, whose molecular spin resonance ringtone corresponds most exactly with that of the DC universe. Johns genuinely lives, breathes, and loves the DC universe. I can't quite explain the occult relationship he shares with this narrative entity, but he is that massive, multi-generational, multi-authorial, living, ongoing, imaginative construction's ideal custodian. As you'll see in the following pages, Infinite Crisis, the early years Geoff Johns conducted what was essentially a course of therapy, deploying Jungian hypersymbolic cultural touchstones like Superman and Batman in the service of an epic adventure story. Infinite Crisis opens on the moon in the ruins of the 90s JLA's aspirational watchtower headquarters. The moon, aside from representing the American Empire's furthest, most utopian extension of its post-war ideals, is also the symbol of illusion, intoxication, madness, and the dark night of the soul. A fitting stage for the Sturm and Drang to follow. The opening lines, "Why are we here? They've forgotten, haven't they?" have their own in-story significance, but they also speak directly to the superhero concept itself. The ensuing scene is redolent with elegiac postmodern self-reflection, grappling with the relevance of characters who were by that time over 60 years old. Following 2 decades of increasingly bleak and often more violent stories, the sense that the DC universe had somehow been corrupted informs much of the action. As our story opens, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, the trinity that makes up the foundation of the DC universe, the templates from which almost every other super character ever created has been derived, have lost their moral compass. Geoff Johns inherits the DC Universe story at a point where Wonder Woman, the ambassador of peace and love, has recently committed murder. Right there. Remember that? Yep. Where Superman seems outmoded and irrelevant in his garish action suit, only inspirational when he's dead, as Batman cruelly and astutely observes, where Batman himself is rendered harsh, alienated, and judgmental by years of trauma. These three open the story conflicted, uncertain of their significance and meaning in a world where the old certainties are crumbling. They immediately concretize the themes of the story to come. This new myth of a lost innocence, as exemplified by the comic book fantasies of a childhood Cold War era, was to become the master narrative of the post-9/11 superhero story. Infinite Crisis offers its own symbolic answer to a very real existential crisis. Johns and his collaborators are way too clever to ignore the dangers of simple nostalgic retreat. In fact, his story here is artfully constructed around a misguided attempt to restore a better, nobler world, which only leads to harm and disaster. He makes it clear that comics and our ideals must evolve to meet the challenges of a new century. The superheroes must be willing to question their motivations and face the darkness head on. Johns is no Silver Age revivalist seeking solace in pastiche or retro styling. His comics are emotionally raw, exceptionally violent, and adult in concept and execution. Otherwise, I'll let Infinite Crisis speak for itself. But to my mind, Johns' vision comes to this. A surging tide of darkness is upon us, but rather than drown in the black waters, we can surf upon the curls, exhilarated. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, Infinite Crisis. Grant Morrison, July 2016, Scotland.
Wow. Dang.
I'll tell you what, man. That was outstanding. I don't think I've ever read that. I don't have that absolute.
No, we don't have the absolute. That's
brilliant.
I wanted to start with that because I don't know if these ideas necessarily came into the reading experience for some people, and they certainly didn't come into my reading experience when I first absorbed this story. But I think it's absolutely a viable take, considering what the story plays with. It's like the competing notions of a better heroism versus a modern heroism, and whether or not there's any like in between ground. And it's just like, what are superheroes? What do they mean to us now after we've gone through so much? Like Batman's kind of a point person in that, and we'll talk about it, but I thought it would set the tone. And I know it's a little long, I'm sorry. But
no, it was good. It was good.
That was beautiful, man.
That was beautiful.
That was eloquently spoken, and it really, I think it really does hit to the core of that's what makes DC so special and what makes Geoff Johns.
Yeah.
Just an unbelievably great Mark. Yeah. Just unbelievable.
Yeah.
You know.
So really quick, Chris, I'm gonna let you handle all the pictures unless I have something in particular. So I'm gonna let you just handle the whole thing. All right. That's cool with you. Thank you. So for me, Infinite Crisis is something that, Chris is one of my best friends. I've known Chris for a while now. God, it's been over 10 years now. We've been like homies. I mean, like me and Chris and I, we lived by each other. So like Chris and I have when we first started podcasting, everyone else was in different states, but we were the only people that actually were by each other. and it was very fortuitous because Chris is a little bit younger than I am. He's about you're about 6 years younger than I am, and which is about what my age is to my older brother, to me. So, and I look at Chris always like a little brother, always, in a good way, the best way. I love him to death. And when we met and hung out, like actually hung out for the first time, it was like we were like instant homies. Like we're already friends, right? Because of podcasts, but instant homies. And one of the things I loved about Chris was he always wanted me to read Infinite Crisis. He always referenced the story, always, since I've known him. He's wanted me to read this forever. And it's one of those things where I just was like, I'll read it eventually. I'll read it eventually. I'll read it eventually. And finally, with the Comic Binge, our YouTube show, which again, thank you for everyone if you're watching this, hit like, subscribe, all that jazz, all that good stuff. I was not like hesitant to read it, but I didn't know I just didn't really feel like the yearning to read it, right? It happens with everyone when your friends are always telling you, watch this, read this. It's like, yeah, whatever, right? And it wasn't until I read Crisis on Infinite Earths years ago that I really started to get to like understand the DC universe. I've always loved DC characters. I've always gotten into the universe and the comics, obviously. But it wasn't until I read Crisis on Infinite Earths that I really started to understand the brevity and I think the foundation that DC was built on following the 80s and before and what came and everything. So when we got to this, I didn't really know what Infinite Crisis was about. I knew there was Superboys, which if you watched the video earlier today, that's what it's about. And that's really it. But reading this today or last couple of days and what we prepped with, but Chris kind of helped us get into the universe and the mindset of what's going on. It is really interesting. And I look at this event way differently than when it was coming out when I was because I got back into comic books. And I think Infinite Crisis was just beginning when I got back into comics. It was that Civil War-ish era, 2004, 5 4 or 5 is when I got back in. I think this was 2008, right?
Yep.
Chris?
You mean this story? This was 2005 to 6.
Okay, so same time. So it was. I remember it. I just kind of it's a DC thing, whatever.
It's weird because this ended like right after it ended was when Civil War pretty much started.
Yeah, I knew it was something like that. So so it's one of those things where I never really I never got around to reading it. And because again, with events, you're always overwhelmed. And that's why the binge kind of exists a little bit for all these things, right? I want people to feel like anyone's welcome. Here's where you start. We're going to help you. And you can follow along with people and friends and talk about it and laugh about it, make fun of each other about it, like me and Chris, and have fun. But in all seriousness, I'm really thankful you made me read all those things. And I almost wish we made everyone read Crisis on Infinite Earths first, because I know one of our previous episodes I said maybe we should have read that, part of the binge, but whatever. I'm very thankful you helped me get into the mindset, because that's one thing you've hit home in the previous episodes. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, I highly recommend it. And we map out where to start exactly. And I really am thankful you did that, Chris, because before we get into the deep of it, and I'm going to throw the Knights of Knee here in a second, I really understood the mindset of these characters way better than I was anticipating, because I read what you told me to read and us to read. So I just want to say thank you for making us read that, even though I didn't always love it. And I don't love everything that I read before, but I appreciate now and understand the mindset, especially that Superman Wonder Woman story. It was probably, or that crossover, which is probably my favorite of the ones we read, besides the intro. I like the intro as well. But that being said, I felt very prepared and really understood the mindset of these characters without having to read, mountains and mountains of comic books, which is no problem. But for time purposes, it was really helpful. Knights of Knee, either one. Curious what your mindset going into it, and as you read it, just as like what I'm talking about, you relate to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like taking bits and pieces of Morrison's introduction, but I always felt like, because I did read this when it came out, and these crossover events, 9 times out of 10, they wind up just falling flat. But I would be lying to you if I was profound, thinking as profound as what the Morrison introduction was, but rereading it now, it's an important story, and there is so much behind it, and it is so relatable. And thinking about the post 9/11 world, which he mentions, it just hits home a lot different. And that's why, to me, this particular story is completely relevant. It's really important to the history of DC.
Yeah, for me, it's when this came out is when I was first reading comics. I was about 11 years old, and I remember trying to read it and trying to read a bunch of things at that time, especially going into like Civil War. And there's, of course, stuff I read and I totally didn't get. I was just flipping through the pages, and then I went back to this, I believe, when I was in high school, and I once again just read this limited series, or this specific story, these 7 issues, and just not to spoil things, but some of the big there's a big thing that happens with one of my favorite characters in DC, and so that's kind of what I was reading it for, is I was just kind of picking out some of the big things. But rereading this now, and to Chris's credit here, reading for the first time all the stuff before this, we have not only helped my mindset and really helped me digest these first 4 issues, but I said on the last episode, it's some of my favorite DC comic stuff I've ever read, because this was an era I missed when I started being fully able to digest DC when I was older. It was all the current stuff, or I would go back to the older stuff that's like the really monumental stuff. Not that this isn't, but this. And like we did on the Spidey Council with that early 2000s JMS stuff, like that was just an era I missed and didn't go back to. And this is really cool stuff. And when you think about, if you love DC characters, there's a certain emotional effectiveness that this type of story has, and that relatability that, like you said. And I was younger in that post 9/11 world, so I didn't absorb it the way adults did and younger adults did. But it was just, it's really heavy, and it's almost fitting that we're reading it in 2022, which all that has happened, COVID and beyond, because you could almost argue that this is as relevant now as it was when it came out.
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting that you're bringing up, Nico, is that it was really, of its time, and how it's almost relatable, even not as much, but a lot even now today, because look at Wonder Woman and the personification of the leaders, and how there's trust amongst your leaders, and no matter which side you fall on, that's where we're kind of at, unfortunately, is that there's always going to be us versus them on either side of the political spectrum. That all being said, even now it's even worse than before, and even people that I would think no one would turn on, people are turning on, like whether it be a cancel culture or whatnot. And like, I'm not saying it's one for one, but there is some relatability with where you have Wonder Woman situation, you have Batman situation, and that's the thing I was taken aback by the series, because one of the things I loved about Crisis on Infinite Earths was that it was very much of this very it's very comic booky in a sense of where it's science fiction based, it's bonkers, it's crazy, it's a load of fun, it's insane, and the artwork is incredible, and the layouts and the storytelling is incredible by both Wolfman and Perez, and it's unbelievable. With this, the one thing I've been impressed with, and I need to analyze a little bit further with Chris, because he knows the story inside and out, it sounds like, or whatever. But there is such a more personal story. It feels, and personal is maybe not the right word. It feels a much more down earth, or I guess more personal, earth kind of relatable story amongst the multiverse craziness that we're going to be getting in this, or we've gotten so far in this comic book. And that's what has probably impressed me the most, is what you kind of touched on, Nico, is like, we're getting this stuff that like is kind of serious, and like kind of is highlighted with what Chris read earlier, but it's surrounded by ridiculousness in the best way possible, right? It's not surrounded by, Gotham Central, I'm fighting the serial killer who killed 8 kids, I'm gonna kill him. It's not like that. It's like, I went through 5 dimension portals and I'm hiding out in this ice cave, and it's like, it's ridiculous. but the themes of the story all remain, And that's the thing that I think most people, when they think of comic books and superhero comic books, they don't realize the themes are way deeper than, at least nowadays in the last 30, 40 years, that they're way deeper and way more interesting than people give it credit for. That's why the MCU and the DCEU exist, right? Because the writers have taken this stuff seriously and have created these great stories. So I was really impressed with how they were able to manage. And I'm wondering, Chris, stop me if I'm wrong. I know Lanning helped Jeff Johns, but this is mostly Jeff Johns, is it not?
I believe. Well, I mean, so the main story, plot wise,
Of course.
it's his. But
impressive.
it was very much a editorial effort from all of the writers that were involved. But I mean, it came down to Johns to condense everything and to push it forward. But I mean, when you have a story, I like what you pointed out about the fact that this is something that has these insanely cosmic shenanigans and these these terrible things that precipitate the events. But at the end of the day too, this is also a story that brings someone like Batman to his knees, literally. It's like there is something that is fundamentally broken about everything that these characters have experienced up until now. And with certain characters, I would argue, like with Batman, and I think I've mentioned this in some of the other episodes that we've done before, there was like a trend to the storytelling where it seemed like he was far more inspired at a creative level by a story like Dark Knight Returns, which is kind of incompatible with DC Universe Batman only because DKR Batman is a guy at the end of his rope. It's a guy who has, been through so much and has been broken as a result of it. He's not in it, but the characterization of that story is very strong, but was applied here. But naturally, that's not it's not a sustainable psychological situation for anybody. I don't care who you are, even if you're Batman. That's not something that you can maintain with any semblance of competency. So what I like the just in terms of the thematic aim of Infinite Crisis, taking that and turning it into a story point about how these are all characters who are at their breaking point. Something has got to give. And they didn't realize that the something that was going to give came from another world, and that they don't even remember what happened that led these people to exile themselves in what they believed initially to be paradise. And we're going to get into more of that stuff in future readings, particularly the Infinite Crisis Secret Files story that was written by Marv Wolfman. But I just love this story for the fact that the DC universe had been spending years being deconstructed. So now the time has come to reconstruct it.
Well said. And, for me, when I think about the story so far and what we've read, and it's interesting where we left off at. And I don't know, we can get into some light spoilers on this. I'm not think it's that big of a deal. I don't want to go crazy spoilers, but just light spoilers is fine. I was surprised of how much Crisis on Infinite Earths. I'm always going to screw those two up. How much it influenced the story, because leading up to it, Chris, and I'm curious, Knights of Neon, let me know if I'm wrong on this. I didn't really up until that one spot, I didn't know how it was going to affect, besides Superboy Earth Prime, I really didn't know how it was going to interject. And so when I read it, I went, oh God, there's the freaking the big giant thing with the head. Is it OMAC? I forgot what his name is.
Anti-Monitor. Yep.
Yeah, Anti-Monitor. Yeah. And I'm like, oh crap, like this is truly a sequel. Now, did they ever say that Zero Year was a true sequel to this?
I don't think it was marketed that way.
No.
It was described as a crisis in time, but it dealt far more with like Mark Waid-ish hypertime concepts than the multiverse. The multiverse was still very dead at that point, but they still wanted to do alternate worlds, so they just decided to take a different tact, and it was kind of convoluted. I like Zero Year, but it was kind of convoluted.
Me too. I liked it too. It was cool.
Yeah. So Nick, man, like, did you read Crisis on Infinite Earths back in the day? Or is that something you really enjoyed?
I did. Yeah. No, I was there for all that stuff, and that was about as groundbreaking, I think, of a story up to that point that I had ever read. And like you said, it was just from the artwork to the story. It was a lot to take in, and involving the whole scenario, the whole multiverse, and all that. But this is, to me, a true sequel, right? I mean, you would agree, right?
Especially with events that happen, in the last few issues, of course. And I think Paul brought up a great comparison earlier that, Crisis on Infinite Earths is it was so comic booky and so nuts. And this, like, when you think about a movie, a lot of times the sequel is a lot heavier and a lot darker and a lot more challenging. And that's exactly what this is.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And it's cool because it also is fitting it came 20 years later, because it also highlights that difference in the way comics were made and written. And did anyone here read the recent, or in the comments, read the recent Tom King Rorschach story? Because there's a big subplot in there, without a spoiler, that actually a pivotal plot point talks about when comics changed and got darker and everything. And
very good.
I thought about that a lot when I was reading this, because of course I wasn't, at the time, I was too young or not alive yet when that big transition happened. So I only know I've seen, when I was introduced to the comics, I saw the diversity of them in terms of tone and weight and everything. But this, I could only imagine actually reading this. And this is what really happened and how the industry changed. And I think for the better, because the story's awesome. So,
and that's by the way, which, Nico, you just opened yourself up for a future upcoming Watchmen series. So just know that's you guys are front in line for that. So just if the Knights of Ni want to be a part of the Watchmen analyzation, when I get more when we get more viewers, Chris, the Knights of Ni will be there.
I got to get a master's degree to do that one, though. There's a whole bunch you can do with that story. I tried to do it once on some other show, and all we did was ramble for an hour.
Yeah, right.
Oh no, that's the best part. That I just call it the gift that keeps on giving, because you can just keep analyzing the same book over and over again, baby.
Paul, another thing too about Infinite Crisis that I was curious about, because there is a part in the second issue where Superman of Earth 2 explains like what happened to the multiverse. Because I remember you telling me in the past that the concept of what had happened with the multiverse was very confusing for you, but this story did it in 3 pages. No,
dude, it's perfect.
I was wondering
George
how
Perez
that
too.
struck you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when you have George Perez doing the layouts of anything, and you're trying to, that guy can explain and compress and draw and explain anything in a short amount of time, because the guy gets the medium, because he knows he has the whole tapestry of panels to use. And if you read Infinite Crisis, and if you read anything he's done, he uses the page. He doesn't waste space.
No.
And that's why I love that man to death, because that guy could say, I need 3 panels. I need 14 panels on this page. Okay, whatever you want, George. It's up to you. And that guy would kill it and make it look amazing.
And he's so evocative of the eras that he's representing, especially like on this page, right? But also too, I mean, it's something that encompasses everything. I mean, the original Crime Syndicate up there in the corner is a big part of it. It lists everything. It basically reborrows a page from the original Crisis there with the Anti-Monitor. And then it invokes, things looked like they were off on the right track. And then things started going wrong. Robin's death, Superman's death, the corruption of Parallax.
What I want to say with this, and I think that you bring up a great point, was I was confused because I thought the Infinite Crisis, oh my God, Crisis on Infinite Earths did a great job of
Crisis 1.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Crisis 1 did a great job of explaining, but like getting everything up together and wrapping it all up. And unfortunately, it probably set up precedents for DC to like, oh, reboots are good. In moderation, and not in like every 40 years, maybe, or every 20 years, more like let's do every 60 years, maybe, but whatever. I digress. That being said, I was just like, how are you going to explain this without being ridiculous? And I will tell you, I'm glad you brought that up. And Nick, I'm going to throw it to you, because again, you're more familiar with this, from the, I want to say the older ab standpoint, but you're more familiar with this stuff even than I am. So As for you read all this way more than I have. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. I'll throw it to you in a second. I was very impressed how they were able to summarize all those in 3 pages and have it make sense. Like that panels you had of the 3, it's like, here's a crime syndicate, here's this, and it breaks it down every Earth kind of like it just helped you. Yeah, that page right there. It was a great way explaining everything a little bit. And honestly, they did a great job explaining how they survived. And I'm like, oh, that's really clever. You had the anti-monitor hanging out. Like it was done very well and cleverly, I thought, to really explain it and have you understand why they're there and everything. So I'll be honest, reading this, maybe we want to go read Crisis on Infinite Earths again. Cause I mean, God, the story's so freaking good. I mean, and maybe we will at the very end of this, guys. When we're all said and done, we'll just sit down and go, let's finally read Crisis, So, for someone, Nick, like you, who kind of you're a DC guy. You grew up on DC. You've always said you're a DC guy. Being a multiverse guy, when you first read this, was this something where you're like, oh, this is like, did it feel at home for you when you first read it and reading it again? Or was this something like, are you a multiverse guy? Because I don't know if you are or aren't. We haven't really talked about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always embraced it. Growing up, my favorite thing was every year the Justice League and Justice Society would have this yearly team up. And I had caught those back in the late 70s. And, they used to call it Crisis on Multiple Earths, and every year they'd have a story. So I'm very much into it, but I can't agree with you more because, look, I'd be lying to you. I didn't remember upon this reread that synopsis and how well done it is.
Right.
Just like you said, it lays everything out. Every era, you get to see the changes in the costumes. You see all the different teams. And as you so beautifully said, I mean, it takes you right up to the point of where good moral starts to get dark.
Yeah.
With Robin's death, with Parallax. It just, so yeah, it was great. I mean, I forgot again how beautifully in those 3 pages it gave me the same feeling where I'm like, you know what? I do feel like going back and reading Crisis.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, I mean, we're reading this now, but it would probably be really cool to just read that and then read this right after it. I mean, to me, that's like, it's such a bookend. It's arguably, whenever you look at these lists, I'm one of those guys. I always like to look at like the greatest comic stories of all time.
Hey, me too, man. I hear you.
And DC, Marvel, and then it encompasses everything. And Crisis is always up there. If it's not number 1, it's number 2. And it was just so. That's the DC guy in me. Now, I love Marvel too. Don't get me wrong. Marvel just a little bit below DC, but this is what being a DC fan does. And, once again, the core of these 3 characters and what they're going through. Superman. I love the line in there when Batman says the last time you were an inspiration is when you were dead.
Oh, that is a line.
That's such a cutting edge line.
That is a line.
Diana, them basically trying to instill in her what she did was so wrong and her really not completely coming to terms with that. So I don't mean to ramble. Go ahead.
And Superman's face when he says that.
Just unbelievable, right? The world's finest. I mean,
but then later when he's looking into the newspaper frame of when he was dead and he says he's right.
Right.
It's wow. And there are moments in this that there's so many cool parts of the DC here, but man, the stuff with the Trinity is unbelievable. I mean, our guy really Batman literally coming to his knees was probably the most standout panel for me because when I read this when I was younger, it did not hit as hard like that. To watch him finally say the words like "I can't do this" and it's just. And to see, and I'm so glad we read the pre-stuff for this because they build Wonder Woman up so
they do
and
really
then
well.
Watching her and everything and here it's so tragic, and I'll call it a tragedy because it's said later in the story, and there's more to touch on, and of course in the future issues. But when I forget who says the line, if it's Superboy Prime or Alex Luthor, when somebody asks, did you control them all to do their things? And he says no, and that was kind of was kind of the beauty of it, is that the 3 of them really did, reach those 3 different breaking points, which was just I like stories when the characters and heroes are challenged. I know a lot of people don't, especially when it comes to film and stuff, but there's something about seeing them get to that point that is so compelling and so relatable. It's very easy to try to relate to superheroes, but you really can't. But when you get a story like this, you go, wow, I can, because they have the same kind of doubts and problems with trust and insecurities and struggle with morality that I think that humanity does in general. So for a story about superheroes, the story makes them all very, very human.
And not just really quickly, Chris.
Yeah.
Not just superheroes, Nico, but like a freaking multiverse story.
Yeah.
Like that's what's so crazy. And that's where I reading these issues. I read the first two on Sunday night, and because I'm always a procrastinator a little bit, like not completely, but a little bit, right? I'm like, I'll read this mostly because I want to keep it fresh before me, and I could read it twice, of course, right? But time is of the essence, right? All that being said, I read the first two issues and I was like, oh, that's way more deep than I thought it was going to be. And then I read the next two issues and went, wow, this is like a really deep story, just drowned in, like I said before, ridiculousness. And that's the thing. Like there is a complexity to this that I was not anticipating. And I want to bring up too, you talk about, a lot of people love to have that happen in their films. And I think specifically for DC, you got to wonder, when you have Marvel has their shtick down, and you don't want to just ape what's previously there. And obviously they were trying to go a different route with Zack Snyder. I don't want to get into that. That's a little different story, which I do want to do on the comic bench at some point, because obviously the comics are the root of it, in my opinion.
I agree.
But the thing is, when you have Jeff Johns, who was an executive producer on Justice League and all those movies at the time, look where this is what he created. He helped emphasize, I think, the strengths of those characters in the comic books. Now, film, debatable, whatever, but let's be real. The comic characters that he helped establish and create, he helped bring all those aspects you brought up. He brought in the Infinite Crisis and really brought the ideas of challenging the heroes in a sense to where what made them who they are, and that deconstruction and the reconstruction that you brought up too, Chris. So that's the one thing I loved about the Trinity here, is he put the Trinity on its face, on its head. And I think that that's what maybe Zack Snyder and Jeff Johns were going for potentially in some small ways. Again, I don't want to get into about a Zack Snyder thing, but I just want to say, I think that's where they're going for. And that was the right idea. Now, obviously the results vary for everybody else, but I do think that was probably the right aspect in comparison to Marvel. And to me, it's more apparent here in Infinite Crisis. The reason I say all that, because in Infinite Crisis, it shows the strengths of doing that with lines like you said, about you last time you were inspired. You see Wonder Woman basically say like, I said this wouldn't fall and it's going to fall, like you see her see it. Like, it's like, oh shit. I mean, again, I like swear on here, public, privately I'll swear all the time. But the thing is, I was like, oh, damn, like that was a big deal. And I think that's where I think the series has made me go, this is a lot better than I was anticipating. No offense, Chris. I was like, damn, like this is deep. So
I've been telling you that. You never believe me when I tell you stuff.
I believe in most things except for Knives Out.
Well, you'll come around.
I'll never watch it.
It's stupid.
I love you.
But one of the things that I think is worth pointing out, because you guys are right in terms of talking about like these are stories about these broad and big icons that are virtually godlike in a lot of respects, right? But at the same time too, this is a story that proves that it need not be binary. This is something that proves that you can have that godlike iconography while still maintaining a semblance of human emotion. And I mean, personally speaking, that's something that I felt was missing from a lot of the recent DC films. They lean too far into the stoic iconography.
That's fair.
And not hard enough into the fact that there's a human heart, even in the chest of a Kryptonian, So I really do feel like this story, in addition to leaning on the strengths of the shared universe, because if anything, Infinite Crisis strikes me as like the prototypical comic book crossover, in the sense that all of the major titles were involved in some way to push the story forward into this release valve. It's all filtering here. And that's not necessarily the kind of narrative uniformity that you get from current comic book crossovers. I mean, I think they try it in certain respects, but I don't think they get quite this strong of a result out of it in a lot of cases. So that's why I picked the things that I did before we even opened up the first issue, was because these are stories that are in primary service to everything that the icons of the DC universe are going to have to go through and overcome in order to get out onto the other side of it. And you have, you know, the big icons in the Trinity, but you also have some pretty notable beats with Dick Grayson, even when Dick Grayson himself isn't on the page. You know, when Batman is talking to Kal-El, to the Earth 2 Superman, about all of the corruptive influences on the planet, he brings up Dick Grayson as an example. So is Dick Grayson just a corrupted version of yours? And Superman has to say no. And that's a nail in the coffin for what he's proposing to Batman. Because if he's just as good here as he is there, then there is hope here. And you shouldn't give up on us. But Batman doesn't say it that way, because at this point in the story, he's still a bit of a broken guy. But another thing that I think is critical too, and I've said this in other places, but I don't really get the chance to talk about him that much anymore, is Connor Kent. We have avoided the issues of Teen Titans that lead up to this moment. And, you know, back in that synopsis, some of the things that Connor Kent went through are alluded to. There you see the L carved on his chest, and he's got a bald head because Connor Kent is a clone of the world's greatest hero and the world's greatest villain. And that's an instance where the villainous side comes out, and he almost kills all of his friends, all of the people that he loves. And that's what has led to his self-imposed exile in Smallville by the time this story starts. So with Infinite Crisis number 4, Superboy Prime makes it very clear how much he resents Connor Kent for what he thinks is taking his name. And it's this, he's charmed by Smallville, but he just can't help himself when he's confronted directly with the vision of Connor, and it leads to blows. Of course it does. And this is really where we start to see how much of a malignant influence Superboy Prime is on the entire story. This is the beginning of a character that goes on a fascinating journey over the next couple of years. Superboy Prime is a major player in the Sinestro Corps War. He shows up in a component of Blackest Night. Johns takes full advantage of Superboy Prime, and he even shows up really kind of a resolution of his story in Dark Knight's Death Metal very recently. So it's something
I'm gonna be right there with you on that, Paul.
I haven't read it, so I don't know. But
the stuff with Superboy Prime is solid. I'm just talking about that stuff. Stuff is solid. But
you did bring up something though that I think is outstanding though, and that is Blackest Night.
Sure.
I tell you what, that's one of my favorite crossovers in the history of comics too. That maybe one day.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Okay. We might have to talk about that. Some point.
Knights of Knee. You keep getting yourselves deep with us.
We read that live together.
And to be honest with you guys, it was a real bonding moment for us
in comics.
Where he was, you were at an age. That
was the first crossover ever.
He was at an age where we could really kind of talk about it.
I was like able to get it too.
Right.
Sure.
You know, so
that was a weekly endeavor, right?
That is
all I will say about Blackest Night in relation to the comic binge is that something is forming. But
something is coming.
Good.
Something is coming. But you know, Infinite Crisis number 4 to me is kind of where the entire story begins to shift. And in our next episode for this binge, we take a little bit of a detour to see some other places and a lot of stuff that specifically,
which is cool. I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. Yep.
With Superman, with Superman of Earth 2, with Connor, and with Dick Grayson. And I love this page in particular because this is really where Batman does solidify the fact that you are, like, he doesn't say it to Dick, but it's like, you are the proof that our world has hope, because he's Dick Grayson. He's the man. You know, like I love that
Yeah.
Batman for someone who has spent a couple of years now without a whole lot of hope, he finds it again in his son, basically. And that's something
so
that feeds
beautiful.
the rest of the story.
It's so beautiful. You know, you brought that up. I was thinking about that in my mind was, of course, when he talks to the older Superman about Dick Grayson, how in a story like this and everything, it really comes back to Batman and his son, Dick Grayson, and how
Amen.
that's pretty much everything to him in the world. How, I mean, is
It's-
that not beautiful?
It's
or not?
funny because it's ever since high school I've become a Dick Grayson. Like he's probably
Yeah.
my second or third favorite
Next to Wally, right?
hero next to Wally and Barry. It's, the Flash as a whole, and then our 2 and 3 are right here. But I love how this is definitely part of the story that I just did not. It's
Remember,
like I
yeah.
was reading a lot of this for the first time
Me too.
again.
Some
Totally.
of that stuff,
And I'm a sucker for any time the comics go out of their way to tell you that Dick Grayson is one of the greatest DC characters of all time.
Hell yeah,
And I
dude.
love
or
that.
the love that
Yes,
Bruce has
no,
for him,
but,
you know.
but that's
Right.
what I mean. I love that Batman's proof of his way to change that Superman as well as Dick Grayson bad here. No, exactly.
I know, that's so cool.
And,
Yeah.
Well
and
said.
I love when also Dick validates Bruce that those were the best years.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep.
To see Batman come to his knees earlier and say, I can't do this anymore. He gets, his son is able to remind him that, at one point it wasn't as dark and despair as it is now. And I think that I think this line gives Bruce hope that they could get back to that.
And that's
Yeah.
the beauty of the legacy heroes,
Yep.
right? Is that it's
Right.
the closest that these characters who will always exist on a floating timeline can get to seeing their children surpass them.
Mhm.
And
That's a
Dick
good point,
Grayson is a perfect example of that.
And really quick, Chris, if you could take off that, I want to kind of wrap this up a little bit here. We're heading closer, not like super right now, but we got a couple of things I want to touch on. The writing obviously is superb. Anytime you take as many characters and how every page, it's like almost every 2 pages, it's a different story. You're going back and forth. It's organized very well. So Jeff Johns should get a lot of credit for writing a great story, but the editor of the stories should be also very well commended, because I never felt like I was being jumped around a bunch, And so, I'm not sure, Chris, what you're doing there. You go. But the thing is, I was really impressed with Phil, is it Jaimez? His layouts really, really, really impressed me, because it felt like he was embodying George Perez, but not aping him completely, but just that's just gorgeous, right? And I wanted, Chris, really quick, can you bring up that Batman and Nightwing page again, where he says it's the best? And I want to make sure people understand this, because one of the things that I think the medium of comics and the medium of film and TV is share, but comics don't get the recognition for this. And I want to make this very clear. One of the things watching Andor, which I adored the new Andor series, but one of the things that you want people to realize when you watch that, it's not just the actors performing, right? It's not just the dialogue they're saying. It's the way the camera is tilted. It's way the way the picture is framed that addresses the audience and gives us a sense of subconsciousness that makes you feel an impression that people just don't. I think, I don't want to say basic people or mainstream people, but anyone, they just kind of forget and take for granted. And in general, I take it for granted too. This page is a great example of, I think, Phil Jaimez, whatever his name is. Again, I'm horrible at pronouncing people's names. Jimenez. Thank you. Sorry. And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just terrible to pronounce.
I know. Paul Dini is Paul Denis to Paul. So
I hate you. But it's true. If you look at this page, it's a great example. I want to show you how there's so many panels on this page. So it's the equivalent of quick cuts for film, right? And look how it gives you the impression that Bruce is brooding behind Dick, but Dick is the light and Bruce is the darkness.
Yeah.
And look at how every angle is so
That's true.
It's so particularly put. The very last page, I love the tilted up angle of Dick Grayson going the best, and you can see that there's just a joy on his face. If you were to do it straight on, it'd be cheesy, it would be dumb. But the way they put the angle of it, it's a very natural, just look of just that is how he feels, and
with
I
the
love
light straight on too.
Exactly.
Like, there was a part of the introduction that I skipped for time, but let me recall it here. As a simple illustration, most superhero comics these days tend to use 3, 4, or 5 panels per page, often using the aspect ratio of the cinema screen. Phil Jimenez arranges his panels like mosaic tiles or multi-screen windows so that some pages have 9, 10, or more frames per page. Here we see the page as a design unit, eschewing the filmic approach in favor of digital overload and close-up focus on details or expressions where time is sliced tighter and harder to recall the rapid editing techniques of music videos.
Preach it, Grant Morrison. God, he kills it on that, man.
This is a badass Absolute Edition, by the way.
I need to get that.
His work blown up to this size does it a lot of favors.
And I'm gonna throw it back to the Knights of Knee about this. I'm curious what you guys' take on this, because especially Nico, you are a big film guy. And I love film too, but that's like your jam. Like, you love cinematography and things like that. So I'm gonna throw it to you in a second here. But I just want to say that's the difference between film and comics, is that film in comics have that likeness. They can do, again, like Grant says it best. It's 4 or 5 panels is very much more cinematic, letting these big pictures to kind of dwell on, but you're not really utilizing the medium completely. People like John Byrne, Phil Jimenez, excuse me. These people are using their tools, all the tools in the shed, and they're not wasting space. And I think that's super impressive. And it's just a lost art, and not all right on artists in the industry, but a lot of them, to be honest. And I'm really bummed, because I don't mind 5-4 panels per page. It's very standard, and I don't think it's a bad thing. But when it's all you give me per page for a 22-page comic, that's why those pages go. It takes me 10 minutes to read a comic book.
Mhm.
It's not enough. So anyway, I've talked enough. Knights of Knee, go ahead and spew on that, my friend.
No, that's a brilliant point. And to talk about it in 2 points, I agree with you that at some points it feels like that's been lost, because I have found myself taking more time and spending more time with issues like these and a lot of things we've done on the Binge, as opposed to not all of the newer comics that come out weekly, because you're right, you just cook through those things because it doesn't always feel like the art is as inspired. But to talk about the comparison between like the comics and the camera, is that I feel like I've been more emotionally moved at times by comics than anything else. And that is because you get to sit with the panel for as long as you want.
Amen.
And I know what someone will say is, well, if you're watching a show or a movie at home, you could pause the screen, but it's not the same. It's not the same because of the motion and what's cool about comics is, like, I could look at that picture. I could look at the pictures of that conversation between Dick and Bruce and sit with those for a long time and really soak it all in. And then I get to move to the next part of the story when I'm ready, as opposed to, film or watching a show live. You have to go at that pace, which, it's just the differences in the mediums. But I agree with you. There's something about and I'll use this word, like the cinematography, if you will, of a comic panel.
It's storytelling. It's a storytelling
that you really get to live in for as long as you want. And that's why when the art is really inspired like this and laid out in a really special way, it does so much more for you as the audience member.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing I could say is the way it's laid out, it just feels bigger and important. And it's so essential to the story that you're reading. And even the one-page action shots where, like you guys said, there's so much stuff going on and the action really is in the background, but it's so beautifully illustrated that you've got something in your hands that's different. This is different than just reading some 5 or 6 page comic book story.
And I love too how Superboy Prime, in some ways, he kind of reminds me of Todd from the end of Breaking Bad. because he's kind of
That's a great analogy.
he's a little dumb in terms of like how much violence he's perpetrating, right? Like he kills someone here, and he's got such insecurities about his intelligence that it results in him blowing someone's head off. And of course he panics, and of course that whips the Titans up into a frenzy to try and kick the crap out of him as quickly as possible. And he just goes full on rage mode, and he doesn't care at that point because he's so angry who gets in his way. And, this is Superboy Prime's story comes to quite a place by the time we get to Infinite Crisis number 7. And I'm glad that Johns decided to keep using him in places that you might not expect in the future. So just like establishing the threat is really, really critical at this point in the story, because things only get crazier from here. But also, Nico, there is a rich history.
I was waiting
Yeah,
for this
there's
part.
your boy.
I was waiting for this part, which actually, ironically, as great and amazing, as cool as this is, we'll talk about it later, it does lead to my frustration with how they've handled Wally West for years after this, and I have to blame this for it, but it's okay, because in the moment, this is freaking... It doesn't get any better than this.
That's the next couple issues, right? That's the next couple issues.
I see where you're coming from. I mean, he does have a little bit of a resurgence, and maybe that's a story that we should talk about, is the Lightning Saga.
The binge just keeps on piling, but it's all good. It's all good.
Well, it's a JLA JSA 1 year later.
No, I know. I got you.
But
I love talking with all you guys. I have no problem adding more.
There's something to be said about how this story is a 20th anniversary story for the original Crisis, and you can't address that unless you address the importance of the Lightning to the Crisis.
Of course. And
please.
No. These moments don't get any better. Right. Like him kissing Linda there, seeing the kid's eyes light up, and then seeing the grandpa part. Is that in the next panel? I mean, that is just, oh God, it's so just the cool. Like, if you're a Flash fan, that's why I was excited to get back to this with all the reread. I know.
Yeah, Jay
can't go on.
Jay can't go on because the Speed Force is gone. Like, this is quintessential Flash stuff, and this is what that's why I love a story like Crisis on Infinite Earths so much, is that the Flash that Barry Allen really gets to be, he does the most heroic thing ever, arguably it's arguably the most heroic thing in all of DC Comics. And then the way they've let Wally take his place, much like a Dick Grayson in a way, and actually grow up and be a really lived in character, then to have it kind of climax here, and like just the scene with all the flashes and what this does for, spoiler alert, in terms of bringing back Barry and everything. It is really, I was joking about how they've handled a few years ago and everything, but it doesn't get any better than this here in terms of, and it's so beautiful to let, him be seen by Bart like that, like his that is that's the coolest. Freaking cool. See them all around together, man.
Papa Nick, do you want to add anything? And we're gonna wrap up. We're gonna have one more thing. And we'll wrap up.
Just that this has been so much fun to revisit the story, and just to have a new take on it, and I think a new appreciation, and then it just further kind of validates, I guess, why I've always been a little bit more of a DC fan. I just really feel like, I don't know. I think like they're just always a little bit more serious. And again, maybe that's where they lose it on the big screen. Maybe that's where there's a disconnect a little bit, but I just, this is the stuff. These are two parts of anybody that reads comic books needs to read Crisis, and then you need to read this.
Yeah. I'm actually, even though it is a little, I will say, it's a little confusing in my opinion. At times it's super dense. It can get overwhelming, but if you just know the Trinity and you like the Trinity, I can't recommend it enough. And I think just if you love comic books in general, I don't think you could not read Crisis on Infinite Earths and like it in some ways, because it pushed the medium forward in a way that superhero comics. I mean, because Secret Wars came out and it was the main. To put in comparison, was when they both came out. Secret Wars was the Armageddon. It was a huge hit, smash hit with the mainstream audiences. It was great. But I feel like Crisis on Infinite Earths is more like the Good Will Hunting, or a little bit smaller, not smaller, but that more independent, like dramatic feel. It's a little bit different, a little bit darker, a little bit not as much as like a main. It's not going to be accessible to all the mainstream people, but it's still a phenomenal story in its own right. Both have their merits, both have their strengths and weaknesses. But I think as the medium of a whole, Crisis on Infinite Earths is what pushes the medium forward, and it's still I think about some of those pages and some of the storytelling. I'm like, it's incredible. The last thing I want to say before we wrap up, or ask you guys, or just kind of comment on also, is Power Girl. If you could throw up Power Girl for a minute for me, Chris. I is very, very surprised I remember hearing about Power Girl, and I knew she was related to Superman in some way. I didn't realize how or what, because I know that she was retconned back in the series. They gave her a lot of interesting dynamics. I'm not sure if they've done anything with her. I mean, I hope they get rid of the boob window. It's super. I hate to say it, it's distracting. I'm not gonna lie.
It's very distracting.
I know it's of the time, but at the same time, I was really intrigued by the character, and I'm like, man, you could tell finding her place was such a big deal for her, and having that kind of backfire at the same time was an interesting dynamic. And I knew nothing about Power Girl. I knew nothing. I still don't know anything, but basically her being Supergirl from a different reality. And again, I thought it was really, really interesting. I'm curious what that meant for you DC heads out there, and heads being Papa Nick and I'm the Reverend, but on Mr. Baby, I'm not sure if he knew anything about this. Oh God, I love that name, by the way. I almost forgot it, but I'm like, wait a minute, no, I gotta bring it up.
Yeah, I haven't heard it yet.
No, not yet, but it's back. It's back. Papa Nick and Reverend, what's your guys' take on Power Girl before we wrap up?
Go ahead, Chris.
I mean, I really appreciated how they laid the baseline for the significance of the return of Earth 2, because it just seems like having someone who has lived on our world that's indigenous to Earth 2 is a pretty critical part of the puzzle, especially in terms of what Superman of Earth 2 is going to have to confront later in the story. But also, too, her story doesn't end here. Johns does some pretty interesting things with her in his succeeding Justice Society title that is directly involved with a potential resurgence of Earth 2 that I really appreciate. It was in Justice Society of America Annual #1 from 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. But her story keeps going, and there's even something to be said about the role of Earth 2 and its ongoing legacy through Blackest Night, frankly. I mean, there's some, but with Power Girl specifically, I think they do a really good job of, Johns does a really good job of building her up as someone who now knows what it's like to come from somewhere, but also, I mean, he built up this character for several years in JSA and JSA Classified. He did a really great JSA Classified story with Amanda Connor dealing with Power Girl. And this is just her on a bigger stage, and now she has to confront not only where she's from, but what her place is going to be going forward, especially if someone comes along and says, hey, let's replace this world with the one we come from.
All right. Well, Papa Nick, you have the last thing on Power Girl?
All I could say is that I go back with Power Girl to the late 70s and early 80s with the JSA and the Adventure Comics. Absolutely. And what Jeff Johns does is he makes her relevant. That's the biggest compliment I give him. You mentioned that JSA series, some of the greatest comic books I've ever read.
I need to read that series.
Was the Jeff Johns JSA runs. Just incredible. You want to talk about Black Adam, Hawkman, legendary stuff in that run.
Stargirl.
Need I say
Underrated
more?
TV
Please.
show. I'm behind, but it's great.
You know,
We are also 2 seasons behind, but we're gonna maybe come back.
That second season's good, man. It's good.
And the
It's
first
really,
one,
really good.
I thought the first one was pretty good. We just haven't.
I love the
we just
first
haven't
one.
went back.
But now granted, like I'm gonna say right now, I'm a little biased because I had a daughter right when
Sure.
that show came out. So I was very
Yeah.
much like it was up my alley and I was
I
feeling
agree,
it. But it's a little rough at first. I think I'm not sure why I kept watching it because it's not like perfect at first, but I for some reason enjoyed it. But then as the series went on, I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it doesn't get enough credit, to be quite honest. And that second season, just like the first, they kind of I think, to be honest, they always have start off kind of not the greatest. I'm not sure what that is, but they always end like there's some really cool stuff they do. Like there's like it sounds stupid. There's an amazing fight scene at night in the school. They do. It's like it's in a hallway. It should be stupid, but it was kind of rad. I'm like, this is awesome. So
Well, we might have to do JSA binge then.
Yeah.
At some point,
guys, here's the Knights of
Here's
Here's
the
the
pile,
binge.
yeah.
It just
Kind of
as long,
first deal.
well,
as long as
and
yeah.
we can't forget that there's a whole weekly series that we are going to be for sure reading after we're done with Infinite Crisis. So there is a fair amount of revelatory information about the multiverse that comes from 52.
We're not done. The Knights of Knee are not done as far as I'm concerned. As long
No,
as they want on, I'm
They
making
will
them come
return.
we
on.
got a long and
The Knights of Knee
apparently
will return.
with 52, Lauer said he was interested. So
Oh, we're getting Lauer. We're gonna do a special Thursday episode for Lauer if he's watching. He doesn't watch my show, but if he does, you're coming on, Lauer. You're coming on. I found, I have the Reverend. I've got Mr. Baby. I've got Papa Nick. I've got Papa Nick. It's perfect. I hope I don't mean disrespect, sir. I hope you know.
Not
that.
at all.
No, it's
Excellent.
endearing.
I
whatsoever,
love.
my friend.
It's been great getting to know you, Nick. It's been awesome. So I
And same here.
say that in complete reverence. And the
appreciate
fact that you guys together are the Knights of Knee, I just love nicknames and it fits you guys.
The Knights of
perfectly.
Me.
It's
There could be
freaking
nothing
perfect.
better than not only are you two great gentlemen, but the fact that we're sitting here talking about a love of comic books is
Oh yeah.
It's
I
awesome.
never envisioned anything like this years ago. So to me, it's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Hashtag
thank you.
Reverendation or
Reverendation.
Reverend recommendation.
Reverend
Your Reverend
recommendation.
recommendation.
Well,
Awesome.
on that note, I think it's
Oh,
a good time
Yes,
to
tell
bring
us.
up exactly what
we're
our
reading
next issue
Yes.
or our next set of
Our
issues are going to be
assignment.
for the
Taking
Infinite
notes.
Crisis binge.
And this one, and so I haven't told the guys this. So next month's booked out, and so we'll probably won't be able to do this till November. So as long
That's
as
great.
November's cool. All right, cool, perfect. All right, so November. Well, I don't know when we'll get that marked down. Yeah, go ahead and throw it up here, Chris, and we'll.
Yeah,
This will be
it-
November's
formatting
reading
is what we'll
material. So if you're not caught up and you're like wanting to, you have plenty of time. If you want to start from the very beginning, episode 1 of the binge, do it, man, because I'm
For
telling you, this has been a blast.
Green it, baby.
Yes.
So we're taking a little bit of a, like I said before, a detour. So Teen Titans number 32 and Teen Titans Annual number 1
No rest for the
is
wicked, man.
checking in with Connor after getting his ass handed to him by Superboy Prime. I think you'll be surprised by the power that it comes from both of those issues, but both written by Johns, of course. I think the Annual is drawn by Ed Bennis, so it's a good looking book. And then we'll do Infinite Crisis number 5. We'll take one baby step forward in the main series, and there's a big conflict in number 5 that sets up kind of a story that serves as a bit of an elegy for the Superman of Earth 2. So that's in Superman Volume 2, number 226, Action 836, and Adventures number 649. And just as a side note, that actually proves to be the final issues for both Superman Volume 2 and Adventures of Superman.
Wow.
Because number 650, it goes back to Superman Volume 1. So those are the
awesome.
issues that we will read for the next episode of our Infinite Crisis binge.
That's awesome, man. This is I'm so thankful and so blessed to know so many great people. And just to add one more thing onto the binge, at one point in the next 5 years, guys, I'm not sure if you guys ever read this. This is not exact. This is pretty much in the wheelhouse of what we're reading right now. So
Yeah.
this another thing onto the never ending pile of this
Binge.
This unbinged. It's unbinged. So yeah. Anyway, Knights of Knee, Mr. Baby, Papa Nick. Why don't you guys pimp your stuff and let's wrap this up, my friends.
You can follow me at N Caruso Jr. on Twitter.
I thought
We'll
you
keep
do
it short and
vigilante.
sweet.
Okay, you can follow me everywhere at Nico Crusoe. The Prime show we do with our guy Zeddy, who's in the comments. The Vigilante 1939. I'm taking a little brief hiatus to regroup and reset in our lives, but we'll be back for our Black Adam tailgate on Friday, October 14th. We'll be shooting out details on Twitter, but for now, just go to my Twitter. You'll find a lot of stuff I do. Just come talk to me. Come DM me, and we'll talk about beautiful stuff.
Yeah, and honestly, like Nico's one of the most entertaining follows on there, man. Like you're gonna get all kinds of stuff, and I love that. You've been quiet lately.
I've been quiet.
I know.
And then I popped off in Vegas a little bit. I was complaining about.
I know you. I see you. I know. I was like, it was so funny because I know a while back you had you were on a trip. We went out in the woods for your work, whatever. And you kind of announced, like, I'm gonna be off grid, you know, and you kind of announced it, so I kind of expected it. And then for a while, like for a week there, I went, I haven't seen Nico post in a while. Like, what the hell's going on with that guy? And then so anyway, I was like, damn, where the hell is this kid? So anyway, I'm glad that you're back. I'm glad. I know you're busy. So you're a young man. You're enjoying your mid-20s. I appreciate that about
appreciate you, brother.
Yeah, appreciate you too, brother. So also I'm gonna say I'm insanely jealous. I wish I could be there for me and Chris both. I'm assuming we both want to be there for your tailgate for Black Adam, because I don't think I'd want to watch anyone besides with Chris, the Black Adam with you guys, other than you guys. So I'm bummed we can't all watch together. Maybe one day we can do something like that. But that would be rad.
That'll happen. It's gonna happen.
That was because I can only imagine watching the Black Adam with you guys, especially with what we're reading right now. It's like it's perfect. So anyway, co-host extraordinaire Chris, why don't tell people where you can find you at, sir?
Yeah, sure. Well, one final note before we actually dismiss is that there are some issues that are not on DC Universe Infinite. That's Adventures of Superman number 649 and the, for some reason, Teen Titans Annual number 1. So,
wish I could have clipped that.
Thank God we've got some time.
Clearly, the answer to that, as usual, is to make sure you go into your boxes or a local shop's boxes, get on your hands and knees, dig through, and find
you know what
it.
You're asking me to do, right? You know what you're asking me to do.
I'm not saying
you know what you're asking me to do. And I'm not going to say it out loud.
I have
anyone
an
who watches
idea.
and knows me, you know what I'm talking about.
I have an idea of what that will mean for Paul, but for everyone else, support your local comic book store and go find your issues.
Hey, I support comic books financially. I want you to know that this is not something I want to do.
Look, we all have
universe.
financial problems because we support comic book stores.
It's like Thanos in Infinity War. I know what I have to do.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I have the strength to do it.
Yeah. It's called.
What did it cost you?
Yeah, everything.
Everything.
And where did it bring you? Back to me.
Well, in any event, so
and then, as we're at the comic book store, lonely. God damn it!
I got a great story for you guys about a Thanos quote when we're done here, but I cannot say it on this.
Oh,
I cannot utter it on this screen.
Right, that's fair.
So those two issues you cannot find on DC Universe Infinite. They might be on Comixology if you're determined to go the digital.
They're not on Comixology, homie. Let's be real.
Okay,
let's be real.
Honestly, you would know better than I would. So thank you for the information.
If it's not on
DCUI,
it's not going to be on Comixology. So,
okay.
But
good to know.
They're at the dark side is many consider to be
the dark side
unnatural.
Is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
How does one learn this power? Not from being a diligent person in the United States. We'll say that much. So anyway, all right.
So just as a quick reminder, the issues on your screen right now.
But go buy them in the comic shop, please. Next. Someone do that, please.
In terms of where you can find me, at Chris Clow on Twitter, CHRISCLOW.
And-
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Where's
right.
the phone?
What the oh God. All right, we're gonna leave. Sorry guys. All right, read more comics. Goodbye.
It's out of reach, unfortunately.
Good.
Sorry. Yeah.
All right. Well,
All right.
Chris, why don't you take us home and we'll call it a night.
Read more comics.
Sounds good.